Good morning, and welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Press, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Yesterday, we concluded with stating that Pope Leo XIII, the successor of Pope Pius IX, put away all pretense and made it clear to the world that the restoration of the temporal power of the Pope was the prime objective of the papacy. Pope Leo XIII stated that the world, as a result of the Protestant Reformation, liberalism as he called it, separated church and state and stripped the Pope of his temporal power, which was a violation of the throne of Almighty God. Okay? He said that because of separating church and state, the nations of the world had prepared the world for calamity. And he says, at the bottom of page 339 in this book, if you're following along in your own copy, he says, against these threatened calamities, he felt himself constrained or forced by virtue of the universality of his spiritual dominion, to warn the world, especially that part of it which has voluntarily brought what he considers affliction upon itself, by separating church and state and establishing freedom of religious belief. See, there's no freedom of religious belief in Roman Catholicism. You either Roman Catholic and you ascribe to the temporal and spiritual authority of the Pope, or you're excommunicated and hauled off to the Inquisition and stretched on the rack or otherwise tortured until you recant and come into full fellowship with the church, or you're exterminated. To me, that's calamity, right? But Pope Leo XIII said the world had prepared itself for its own calamity by separating the powers of church and state. And he said they have voluntarily brought what he considers affliction upon itself by separating church and state and establishing freedom of religious belief, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and free popular government. See, Roman Catholic canon law forbids all of these liberties. It forbids freedom of religious belief. Roman Catholic canon law forbids the freedom of religious belief. It forbids freedom of speech. It forbids freedom of the press, and it forbids freedom of popular government. Roman Catholic canon law is diametrically opposed to everything connected with the Protestant Reformation, or as a result of the Protestant Reformation. The ideal or the only legitimate condition of the world, according to the papacy, no matter who holds that office, is a restoration of the temporal power of the Pope and to throw the world back into the Dark Ages, where the Pope was free to rule as he pleased, and the kings of the earth were at his disposal to impose his will by force upon the people. Now, Pope Leo XIII seems to have allowed his mind to become disturbed and agitated by this gloomy condition of affairs, because it has been produced by the rejection of the Pope's divine right to regulate whatsoever sentiments and opinions he may deem to be within the circle of his spiritual jurisdiction. Okay? His spiritual jurisdiction demands that he has also the temporal jurisdiction. In other words, let me put it plainly. If you acknowledge the Pope's spiritual power, then you must, by default, accept his temporal power, because the one demands the other. And because of the Protestant Reformation and liberty and freedom and the separation of church and state, the Pope is deprived of his temporal power and only has remaining a claim to a spiritual power which the Bible does not give him. See, the Bible does not give him his authority in this world. Neither does the Bible give him his name and title. Vicar of Christ, the replacement of the Son of God on earth. There's no such thing as a replacement of Christ. This is his creation. And everything that's in it. This papacy is a usurper of the rightful jurisdiction of Jesus Christ. It says, quote, "The cause of these evils," he says, "lies principally in this, that men have despised and rejected the holy and august authority of the church, which in the name of God is placed over the human race, and is," quote, "the avenger and protector of all legitimate authority," unquote. That is, that no authority whatsoever, whether of governments, peoples, or individuals, can be set up against it as rightful or legitimate. There's no other legitimate authority in the world than the papacy. And any government or any nation or any individual who sets up their rights in opposition to the papacy is not legitimate. Where does that put the Protestant Reformation? Where does that put Jesus Christ? Because certainly he is in opposition to the papacy. He says, "Then, looking down from this high pinnacle upon the disturbed and raging elements below, and sorrowing because his temporal dominion has been lost, he enumerates some of the principal causes which, in his opinion, threaten to wreck the happiness and welfare of society. Among these, he makes conspicuously prominent the following: overturning the constitution of the church bylaws in force, quote, in most countries, unquote, obstacles to the quote, free exercise of the ecclesiastical ministry, unquote, which those laws have created, quote, the unbridled liberty of teaching and publishing all manner of evil, unquote, depriving the church of, quote, the right, unquote, which he considers irrefragable, to, quote, train and educate the youth, unquote, and far from being least in magnitude or importance, the sacrilegious violation of the divine law by the abolition of the Pope's temporal power and imperial sovereignty over the Italian people. This enumeration was manifestly made, as may be implied from the language of his biographer, to enable him to point out more clearly to the quote-unquote Catholic hierarchy, that's all the priests, prelates of the church, in all parts of the world, quote, toward what purpose their common zeal must be chiefly directed, unquote, that is, what he expects them to contribute toward turning the world away from these modern, and you may read that, Protestant innovations upon the papal policy, so that it may be carried back to its condition during the Middle Ages, when the papal supremacy was maintained by the terrible tribunal of the Inquisition. That's what historians relate about the direction the Pope would take the world. A return to the Dark Ages. When the Inquisition was the sword of the papacy. Anybody who rebelled against the Pope, denied any of his power, failed to recognize him as the replacement of the Son of God on earth, the supreme teaching authority of the whole church, and the educator of children, the director of all consciences. It was the Inquisition. Torture. coercion. And, of course, the papacy lauded the Inquisition as a holy institution. That it was an act of mercy by the church to return that recalcitrant or apostate into conformity to the church in order to save his spiritual everlasting life. And of course, the attitude was that they were doing God's service. And if all else failed, the holy office of the Inquisition, after all the tortures and interrogations, if it failed to gain an acquiescence from the victim, simply handed that victim over to the state to be executed. Of course, that was in her more finer days. Originally, the Inquisition just did them in themselves, the priests. They had the blood on their hands. But because of the temporal power of the Pope, the papacy gained the authority to command the state to do the executions. And, of course, leaving the Roman Catholic Church as seeming to be the merciful re-educator of people. The Pope would restore the world, the entire world, to those days when it determined what was right and what was good, and those who held out against it were subject to the Inquisition. That's why this program is called Inquisition Update, because this is the obvious direction the papacy would take the whole world, back to the days of the Inquisition. And the Inquisition is in place and still working today. It's called the penal system of the United States. He says that he prefers that period with its ignorance and superstition to the present with its advanced enlightenment and prosperity is plainly and emphatically avowed in these words, quote, "If any sensible man in our day will compare the age in which we live, so bitterly hostile to religion and the Church of Christ, to those blessed ages when the Roman Catholic Church was honored as the mother of the nations, he will surely find that the society of our day, so convulsed by revolutions and destructive upheavals, is moving straightway and rapidly toward its ruin, while the society of the former ages, when most docile to the rule of the Roman Catholic Church and most obedient to her laws, was adorned with the noblest institutions and enjoyed tranquility, riches, and prosperity," unquote. That's what the Pope says. Because of the Protestant Reformation and liberty, the world is headed for ruin. We must return all the world back to those days when the Pope ruled supreme, the Church was all in all, the mother of the nations, and then we will return to tranquility, riches, and prosperity. Despite the fact that if you look at the world today, the poorest nations of the world are those dominated by the Roman Catholic Church. For Roman Catholicism is the national sponsored religion, and all other religions are merely tolerated at best and persecuted at worst. He says this is strange infatuation to be indulged in during the 19th century when human energy is taxed to the utmost to give increased velocity to the car of progress and to outstrip all previous ages in placing checks and guards upon the ambition of temporal monarchs. It requires but little research to learn that the quote-unquote blessed ages to which Pope Leo XIII refers and gives such remarked reference over the present period were especially distinguished by the ignorance and superstition of the multitude. History is crowded with evidence of this. Maitland, who is highly appreciated and often quoted by papal writers on account of his criticisms of Robertson, the historian, says that, quote, the ecclesiastics, that is the priests of the Roman Catholic Church, were the reading and the writing men, unquote. The priests of the Roman Catholic Church were regarded to be those only ones who were educated in order to read and write. The ecclesiastics were the reading men and the writing men. Close quote. And it says, but does not pretend that such was the case with the peasants or the common people, as the bulk of the populations were called. There is nothing better established than that no facilities for learning were afforded the common people, and that they were kept down at a common level of ignorance, so as to reconcile them more easily to submission and obedience. This is shown by the picture of society drawn by all the early chroniclers, especially by Froissart and Maustrellet, as well as by the more modern historians Hallam, Robertson, and Barrington. The men of learning and letters, that is, those who could read and write, belonged to the quote-unquote upper classes, for whom alone colleges and schools were provided. Okay? The schools and colleges that were provided during those dark days were especially for the priests, those who were being fitted for the ecclesiastical wing of the church, the priestly class. You know, people talk about this nameless and faceless entity they call the rich ruling elite. Well, during the Dark Ages, the rich ruling elite were the priests. They were the ones who were educated to read and write. They were the ones who supposedly read the Scriptures and interpreted the Scriptures and wrote about the Scriptures and taught the people about Christianity. Well, it wasn't Christianity at all. It was Roman Catholicism. It was set up not to glorify Christ, but to glorify the church and the Pope as the vicar or replacement of Christ. And the people were pressed down and held ignorance so that they couldn't have any hope at all of escaping the tyranny that was set up around them by the Roman Catholic Church. The schools and the colleges were provided for these upper classes, the rich ruling elite, the ecclesiastics of the church. Now, when they talk about the rich ruling elite today, who do you suppose they're talking about? Well, why don't we just name them instead of just using a vanilla term to describe them? Yes, they're the rich ruling elite, but who are they? The priestly class. Those are the ones who are designed by the papacy to rule this world in his behalf. They're the ones who are given the power. They're the only ones that know what's really going on in this world. We're all left to be ignorant. That's why they insist the press be controlled and that speech be controlled. So we cannot learn and know what is really going on in the world so we can resist it. They want blind obedience. And we're obviously blind because of the bull-loading we get out of the mainstream and the alternative medias. Nobody's prepared to fight the rich ruling elite because they don't even know who they are. They're the same today as they were during the Dark Ages. Those who have acquiesced to the temporal and spiritual power of the Pope. And if they're unaware of that temporal and spiritual power that is controlling them, they're simply used in their ignorance to follow the system as they're building it. He says the people, as such, were left uninstructed in order to make them passively obedient to the authority of the church and the state, which were united by ties they were powerless to break. That's what the papacy would restore in all the world. And that's what is being done right here in the United States of America. church and state being so solidly united that the people are powerless to break it. And certainly they can't break it if they won't even acknowledge it as to be the truth. The church and state are now united and both mutually sacrosanct, holy institutions. Whenever the Roman Catholic Church had control of the government became untouchable. The people dare not speak a word against the king. And obviously they dare not speak a word against the Pope, from where the king got his authority. That's what is happening in the United States today. Church and state are united and sacrosanct. Anybody who raises a critical voice against the papacy or against the state is labeled psychotic or a domestic terrorist or any other epithet and hauled off in a paddy wagon and interrogated under hot lights. Of course, it's all made to be like they're treating this Reedy woman for out speaking on the House floor, taking control of the microphone and condemning Freemasonry as those who signed the founding documents of this country and played so much a role in the revolution of this country from England. She's being treated like she's suffering some psychosis. And she did nothing on the House floor but state the truth, the gospel truth. And such is going to be the case and always has been the case with God's people who speak out against the king or the pope. And some of the founding fathers, some of the people in the colonial period realized that there must be an amendment, a provision in the Constitution and Bill of Rights guaranteeing freedom of speech in this country. Guaranteeing that there be no establishment of religion in this country, as there was in the dark days, in Middle Ages, where Roman Catholicism was the firmly established and sole religion. Everybody else was a heretic to be burned at the stake. And they insisted, knowing full well the history of these dark ages, that freedom of speech must be maintained. It must be the right of every American citizen, the duty of every American citizen to speak out against the king and the pope if church and state should ever be united again. That's literally why we have the First Amendment. Repeat after me. The First Amendment was given so that we would always have the right to criticize both the church and the state, the Pope and the King. The freedom of speech that I'm exercising this morning is forbidden in Roman Catholic canon law, and it's soon to be forbidden in the laws of this country. Church and state are now united and sacrosanct, holy institutions. Anybody who speaks out against the Pope or the state are speaking out against God himself. That's the impression that they would try to force on every American who does not have the knowledge of history to resist it. We've come up upon the break. We'll continue with the reading and discussion of the book, The Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson. You're listening to the Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
In this day of economic uncertainty and soaring unemployment, safe investments are often hard to find. But investing in the precious metals is the safest investment of all, because gold and silver is real money. Government-printed currency is not. Call Melody Cedarstrom at Discount Gold and Silver Trading Company at 1-800-375-4188. Melody has been helping people secure their financial future for over 10 years. While others in the business claim honesty, Melody will deliver. Give her a call, 1-800-375-4188. That's 800-375-4188.
Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Welcome back to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. If you support Inquisition Update, you must support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. Send Nicholas a thank you and a prayer. And I give my thanks and prayers also for the privilege of being on First Amendment Radio and sharing this rare history. The historians paint us a picture of these dark ages. Both early chroniclers of history and the more modern chroniclers of history come to the same conclusion. The men of learning and letters of those days belonged to the upper classes. Who were the upper classes? The landed entities. Okay? The papacy owned most of the land. The Roman Catholic Church owned most of the land. And it was given to these so-called upper classes to control those lands, to manage those lands for the papacy. The land was not owned by the common people. They worked the land, but they were forbidden to own it. The only people who could own land were those who the papacy gave land to manage. Okay? Ownership was transferred to them to hide assets from the church, for the church. And they were given the responsibility to manage that land and control the people. These were the upper classes, the landed classes. So they served the church. You have to understand, they served the church. And because they faithfully and loyally served the church, the papacy and the churches made sure that colleges and schools were available and provided to these landed classes. The poor people didn't have the money to go to school, and they weren't encouraged to go to school. Their ignorance was determined to be the only way to keep the people in submission to the church. So they simply priced education up beyond their means and kept them poor so they couldn't get in. They couldn't free themselves. It was a social structure guaranteeing the sovereignty of the papacy, the wealth of the church, and the control of the people. It says the people as such, the commoners, like you and me, who have to work for a living, they were left uninstructed in order to make them passively obedient to the authority of the church and state, which were united by ties they were powerless to break. This is the condition of society, that the papacy would return the whole world. The return to the Middle Ages. He says they were forced, but with little less severity than was shown to the captives of Pharaoh, who built the pyramids, the temple of Karnak, and other Egyptian monuments, to serve taskmasters in erecting magnificent palaces, cathedrals, and churches designed for display by those whose vanity and pride made them oblivious to the fact that they were the product of unrewarded labor and did not contain a stone or marble block not stained by the tears and sweat and blood of numberless humiliated victims. Is that what we want for ourselves and our children? Servitude to a modern-day Pharaoh? That's what the papacy is. He says, but all these unrequited victims were ignorant and therefore obedient. Obedient and therefore happy is the logic that the papacy uses. But Pope Leo XIII, exulted at this reflection, instructs the modern nations that the curse of God is resting upon their progressive advancement, and that he, in Christ's name and place, is divinely empowered to turn them back to those quote-unquote blessed ages, because if they do not, quote, they must, by corrupting both minds and hearts, drag down by their very weight nations into every crime, ruin all order, and at length bring the condition and peace of a commonwealth to extreme and certain destruction. If we don't return to the Middle Ages, when the Pope ruled supreme, the world is destined for destruction. Protestantism is destined to destroy humanity unless we return to Roman Catholicism. That, in a nutshell, is what this Pope says. Jesuit-trained Pope Leo XIII, the supreme monarch. He says to escape these dreadful consequences and save modern society from keeping open the gaping wounds it has inflicted upon itself, he makes known his pontifical purpose in these words, quote, we declare that we shall never cease to contend for the full obedience to our authority, for the removal of all obstacles put in the way of our full and free exercise of our ministry and power. That's the silver key and the golden key, the temporal and spiritual power. And for our restoration to that condition of things in which the provident design of the divine wisdom had formerly placed on the Roman pontiff. unquote. The papacy, through Leo XIII, said we will never cease to restore what God gave the Pope. He says, having thus instructed all the faithful that whatsoever prohibits the Pope from acquiring all the power and authority formerly possessed by the popes must be resisted and put out of the way, whether it be constitutions, listen, Americans, whether it be constitutions, laws, or customs, he declares them by way of encouragement that the world shall have no rest until this is accomplished. Quote, not only because the civil sovereignty is necessary for the protection and preservation of the full liberty of the spiritual power. Yes, that's right. He says the temporal power in every nation, its sole purpose is to preserve the liberty, the full liberty of the papacy and his spiritual power. In other words, to make Roman Catholicism the state-sponsored religion. He says not only because the civil sovereignty, that is the civil power, is necessary for the protecting and preserving of the full liberty of the spiritual power, but because, moreover, a thing in itself evident, whenever there is a question of the temporal principality of the Holy See, then the interests of the public good and the salvation of the whole human society are involved, unquote. In other words, if you don't restore the temporal power of the Pope, his spiritual power has no power, and the salvation of the entire human race is lost. Okay, so it makes it a matter of religious imperative that the temporal power of the Pope be restored in all nations where it had been lost, and extended to nations where it had never been experienced. This is the command for every Roman Catholic on pain of eternal damnation to restore the temporal power of the Pope all over the globe, to make him a sovereign, independent, irresponsible King of Kings and Lord of Lords. This is the New World Order. Now, you can go to any mainstream media source or any alternative media source, and this will never be discussed. They'll speak in vanilla terms about the rich ruling elite, but they'll never tell you they are the priests of the Roman Catholic Church and those upper classes, those landed classes that serve the papacy. They're never going to tell you that. They don't tell you that because you're ignorant of it. That's why you're ignorant of it. Only Inquisition Update and a few other ministries that I've become recently aware of would tell you any of these things. It's important for Inquisition Update to stay on First Amendment Radio. I have just a small voice, and it fails me occasionally. But as long as God gives me breath, I have to warn the American people what's happening to their country and put a name and a face on the faceless people that are nameless and faceless people that are taking over this country, and for whom. Pope Leo XIII enthusiasm is always heightened, and his eloquence of style becomes captivating when his mind displays its power at the contemplation of that temporal sovereignty by which he hopes that he and his successors shall bring all mankind within the bounds of the pontifical jurisdiction, so that they shall have no care for this or a higher life, but what is involved in the duty of passive and uninquiring obedience. That's what's going to be achieved in the New World Order. Passive and uninquiring obedience by every man, woman, and child in this country and around the world. They want you to become just like a little Jesuit in the service of the Black Pope, without thought or will of your own, passive and uninquiringly obedient to that power that claims divine right to rule. The only power on the earth that has ever declared the divine right to rule the world, the papacy. He says it is when this enthusiasm fully possesses him that he seizes upon the occasion to give the word of command to his ecclesiastical army, his army of priests in all parts of the world, as when he tells them they must display their, quote, priestly zeal and pastoral vigilance in kindling in the souls of their people the love of our holy religion, in order that they may thereby become more closely and heartily attached to this chair of truth and justice, accept all its teachings with the deepest assent of mind and will, and unhesitatingly reject all opinions, even the most widespread, which they know to be in opposition to the doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church, unquote. Okay, these words create a global, priest-led militia, motivated by religious motivation to elevate the papacy to global supremacy. Now you think you might understand who really controls the Bilderbergers, whoever they are, the Club of Rome, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, the United Nations, Freemasonry, the rich ruling elite. I just put a name and a face on all of these people. It's the Pope. He's everywhere. In every secret society, all subservient to the Jesuit order, and they are bringing about this new world order that's simply the reestablishment of the old one. Exchanging light for dark. Exchanging the light of Christ for the darkness and tyranny of the papacy. The biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist. There's no longer any excuse for anybody to continue to use these vanilla terms, these nameless and faceless terms, when you know deep down in your heart everything I'm telling you is the absolute truth. You can verify it in history. You can verify it in the Scriptures. So when you're in a discussion about these nameless and faceless organizations, why don't you just show them the linkage to the papacy? How about the Federal Reserve Bank? Well, everybody knows they're run by the Rothschilds. Well, who are the Rothschilds? They're the guardians of the Vatican Treasury. In other words, the Federal Reserve Bank is a Vatican bank. And it's in just as much trouble as is the bank at the Vatican. Money laundering, corruption, won't show its books to anybody, isn't held accountable by anybody. Why? Because it shares the sanctity of the papacy. Nobody can pry into the affairs of the papacy. Nobody can pry into the affairs of the Vatican Bank, and nobody can pry into the affairs of the Federal Reserve Bank, because they're owned and operated by the same people. Make sense? You wonder why the Federal Reserve Bank isn't accountable to anybody, even the government of the United States, because it's not owned by the government of the United States. It's owned by the Vatican. Now I just put a name and the face on the Federal Reserve Bank. The papacy. He's everywhere. Why? Because forever the papacy has made it a matter of religious dogma that every Roman Catholic in this world form themselves into religio-political institutions, which I just named, to bring about the elevation of the papacy to global monarchical status and to achieve uninquiring obedience by all the people. R.W. Thompson's got it right, man. There's no doubt in my mind, and there can be no doubt in any rational mind, who really is at the head of this new world order. Do you think God would have made it so difficult, as the mainstream media and the alternative media make it sound, to figure out who really owns and controls the world? Do you think God, who went out of his way to make sure that the Jews did not miss their Messiah when he came, through the prophet Daniel, yet they did, do you think he would not be, God made it virtually impossible for the Jews to miss their Messiah. Do you think God would leave us ignorant about who the Antichrist is? Why would God deal so treacherously with his people as to leave them unaware of who his satanic counterpart is in the world? It defies logic, but this profane logic is what is taught in all the churches. Well, we don't know who the Antichrist is. Well, why in the world don't you know who the Antichrist is? Who corrupted your mind? All the Christians of history knew who the Antichrist was. The Pope of Rome. The Protestant reformers all knew it. Why are we in our generation so ignorant about who the Antichrist is? There's not one of us that needs to be ignorant. And just as confident as to the identity of Antichrist in the world as we are confident as to the identity of the true Christ of heaven. God did not deal treacherously with his people. And just as evident as Christ is our Savior, is the evidence that the papacy is his earthly, satanic counterpart, enslaving the whole world when Christ came to make us free. He says this instruction is comprehensive enough to include all, both priests and laymen. It has the merit of simplicity, requiring only obedience to the Pope, the full assent of mind and will to all the doctrines that he shall announce, and the rejection of all opinions in opposition to them, no matter if their submission shall involve disobedience to the Constitution and laws under which they may live. The papacy demands, if necessary, rebellion against the Constitution and laws of this country by every Roman Catholic for the purpose of elevating the papacy's temporal and spiritual authority in this country. The Constitution is, to them, just a GD piece of paper when it comes to the authority of the Pope and his temporal and spiritual power. And you know now why George W. Bush, the skull and bonesman, subservient to the Jesuit general, can describe the Constitution of the United States as just a GD piece of paper. And I ask the question, what G in his life damned the Constitution of the United States? It wasn't the God of heaven. It was the God in Rome. And here we are reading in history the condemnation that the papacy has always had for the Constitution of the United States and every other constitution that liberated the people and gave them rights. And especially in Roman Catholic countries, even in Italy. Anytime our Constitution is assailed, the first list of suspects should be the papacy. The papacy has made an occupation of damning as heretical every liberty that we enjoy in this country, including our Constitution and our form of government. I just put a name and a face on the New World Order. It can't be denied. He says he descends also to particulars and describes a course of conduct for all his subordinates. Who are the subordinates of the Pope? Everybody. Whether they be Roman Catholic or Protestant or anybody else. He says, like a commanding general laying down the plan of a military campaign. That's what it is, a military campaign. That's why the Jesuits are the militia for the Pope. That's why the Knights of Columbus are a militia for the Pope. That's why every monastic order of the Roman Catholic Church is regarded as a militia for the Pope. That's why the United States military is regarded as a militia of the Pope. He says they must obtain the control of education. You wonder why education is so corrupt in this country? What information are they hiding our children? This information right here. That's why the Roman Catholic Church must get control of education. They don't want the American people to know from the cradle who the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist is. That's why Rome works day and night, never sleeps to get control of education in this country, from cradle to grave, from the preschool all the way to the universities. He says they must obtain the control of education so as to scatter the seeds of heavenly doctrines broadcast in order to save the young especially from the deadly influences of state and public schools where according to this teaching, the method of education clouds the intellect and corrupts the morals. They are required to instruct their pupils in conformity with the Catholic faith, especially as regards mental philosophy as taught by the great satanic Dr. Thomas Aquinas and the other teachers of quote-unquote Christian wisdom. They are to make exterminating war upon the impious laws which allow civil marriages, because those thus united, desecrating the holy dignity of marriage, have lived in legal concubinage instead of Christian matrimony, unquote. As I said on a previous program, marriage is regarded as a sacrament of the Roman Catholic Church. Only the Roman Catholic Church and its priesthood have the authority to wed a man and a woman. That any marriage that is not derived from a priest in a Roman Catholic Church is living in filthy concubinage. And I asked the question that I asked before, where was God, or where was the Pope when God married Adam and Eve? Where was the Pope when God married Abraham and Sarah? Where was the Pope until about 538 AD? How did this world survive without the Pope for most of its history? You say you weren't married in a Roman Catholic Church? Then you're living in filthy concubinage and your children are bastards. That's the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church, and that authorizes the papacy to correct you by whatever means at his disposal. That's it for today. We'll continue with the book, The Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson on the program tomorrow. You've been listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. I'll see you tomorrow.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.